Hey, welcome to you. So happy you're joining me here in sunny Florida as we continue this series. I want to begin by asking you a question. If you could give anything at all to those around you, to those people who intersect your daily life, what would it be? And I don't mean tangible things necessarily like money or stuff, but intangible things like encouragement or love or a good example. What would you give? Think about that a moment. Let me make a suggestion. How about hope? In fact, that's one of my primary goals for every one of you that follow us here online. That you would walk away from our time together here with a sure word of hope in your heart. Because this is what I know. I know that all of us have seasons where we have difficulty coping with adversity, with anxiety, with stress. Times when we feel more hopeless than we do hopeful. Have you found that to be true? So maybe today you need a fresh word of hope. Or maybe you know people and interact with people who need some hope. Let's talk about that. Did you ever see the old movie Hope Floats? Sandra Bullock plays the role of Birdie, whose husband left her for her best friend. And they revealed the secret of their affair to her on a TV talk show with a national audience. So in the movie, Sandra Bullock returns home to Texas with her daughter and moves in with her parents as she attempts to build a new life. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie, there are some really emotional scenes. One in particular, at least where I cried the hardest, was when the little daughter stood at the curb crying after begging her daddy not to leave them and to take her with him. I'm talking tearjerker to the max. However, overall, this is actually a really beautiful movie with a happy ending. It's a movie that has so much to say about hope. So I would recommend you watch that movie if you haven't seen it. In fact, at the end of the movie, Birdie is walking along with a new friend holding one hand and her daughter holding the other. And with the sound of a carnival beside them and the sight of fireworks illuminating the Texas skies, she dares to risk everything, that everything is going to be okay. Then she makes this statement to her daughter. She said, "Mama used to say that beginnings are scary, endings are usually sad, but it's the middle that counts the most. You need to remember that when you find yourself at a beginning. Give hope a chance to float up, and it will too." Now remember, we're in a series from 1 Peter called Finding Hope When Your World Seems Hopeless. And you may remember also that these people Peter is writing to were suffering horribly. Under the persecution of the wicked Roman ruler Nero, families were being separated, many were being killed and tortured, and the idea of hope was very hard to come by. By the way, how many know we too are living in some times that often seem to be hopeless? We too are hungry for hope, are we not? Hope that we will get beyond the threat of these viruses and the civil unrest and the political turmoil and the overall sense of gloom and doom. So today, let's take a look at what the Apostle Peter says about how to have hope and how to give some hope away to others. And I'll give you two things today, okay? The first one is that hope floats as we revere Jesus. In verse 15 of chapter 3, it says this, "But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord." Now think about that. Revere Christ as Lord. That word revere means to esteem, to acknowledge, and to live in such a way that Jesus is preeminent in your life. For instance, have you ever talked with someone and after the conversation you walked away thinking, wow, now that is a Jesus person? Did that ever happen to you? Well, in effect, what we are saying by that is that here is a person that reveres Jesus in their life. And by the way, when people walk away from a conversation with you, what do you suppose they're thinking? Just some food for thought. Revere also carries the idea of setting something apart as special and valuable, as in something that you cherish. Like when I was a kid in the 60s, I collected baseball cards. And I had all the big boys, Mays and Mantle and Yogi Berra, Ted Williams, Henry Aaron, Stan Musial. Well, one day I came home and I found that my little brother and his little friends were using my cards, the good ones, mind you. They were using them as a motor on their bicycle. Do you remember when you were a kid how you'd put playing cards on your spokes, and then when you drove they would make a loud sound? Well, that's what they did with my cards. To my brother and his friends, the cards were just cards. But to me and my potential bank account, I counted them as valuable and cherished. Peter says that is the way it is with Jesus and our lives. He is our cherished one. Nothing compares to Him. Nothing that I can want, nothing I can need or even desire can compare to Him. So listen, He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the solution to every problem. He's the answer to every one of your questions. He is the fulfillment of every one of your needs. That's why in Acts chapter 17, the writer says, in Him we live and move and have our being. In other words, it's all about Jesus. And the truth is that hope and sharing that hope comes way more easily when we believe and live that out. Because Peter goes on to say in this verse, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you. Give the reason for the hope that you have. Now, a relatively new believer of Jesus wrote a letter to a person who had influenced her the most in discovering Jesus. Here's some of what she wrote. Let me read it to you. She said, you know, when we met, I began to discover a new vulnerability and a lack of pretense that impressed me. I saw in you a thriving spirit, no signs of internal stagnation anywhere. I could tell you were a growing person, and I liked that. I saw you had strong self-esteem, not based on the fluff of self-help books, but on something a whole lot deeper. I saw that you lived by convictions and priorities and not just by convenience and selfish pleasure. I had never met anyone like that before. I felt a depth of love and concern as you listened to me and did not judge me. Now watch this. You tried to understand me. You sympathized and you celebrated with me. You demonstrated kindness and generosity, and not just to me, but to other people as well. And you stood for something. You were willing to go against the grain of society and follow what you believed to be true. And for those reasons and a whole host of others, I found myself really wanting what you had. Now get that. Really wanting what you had. Now that I've become a Christian, I wanted to write to tell you that I'm grateful for beyond words for how you lived out your Christian life in front of me. Now, what gives that person such an aura and influence that she's writing about? What makes another person want to so emulate their life? It is what Peter is speaking of here. It is the hope that comes from esteeming and revering Christ so deeply that others see Him and are drawn to Him. Because here's the deal. When you have to walk through a valley, or you have to suffer and experience some pain, and you do it with grace and confidence and hope, because of your walk with Christ, guess what happens? What happens is you fulfill one of the primary purposes for living, which is to float hope, the hope of God, to another person. Okay, let's move on. Hope floats in us and then through us to others as we revere and esteem Jesus. And secondly, as we remain confident. Watch verse 14. Listen to this. But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear the threats. Do not be frightened. Here's the deal. Living with a consistent sense of hope and then floating that hope to other people will always be challenged by the enemy of fear. And how many of you know facing the foe of fear is no joke, right? In fact, the word Peter uses here that we translate as fear is actually the word for terror. It is the same word Jesus used in Luke 21 when he was talking about the conditions that would exist in the world just prior to his return. He said, men will faint from terror. Literally, hearts will fail because of terror. When I was young and growing up, the word terror or terrorist, that didn't really mean much to us as we were growing up. Maybe you grew up years ago when it was like that for you. However, since 9/11, those words have become primary in our everyday vocabulary, haven't they? And besides the killing and carnage, one of the primary goals of those who terrorize is to produce fear in the people they're attempting to terrorize. Because they know that fear paralyzes and otherwise inhibits normality while impeding many of our freedoms. In fact, just look how these viruses and the assorted ways to combat the viruses have virtually imprisoned us to the enemy of fear. So many people today I run into are fearful. So yes, there are some scary things going on around us today, but God tells us in the midst of those scary things to what? He says to fear not. God always says to us in His Bible, do not fear. That's no doubt why the phrase fear not or do not fear is found in the Bible some 365 times. In other words, one of them, there is a fear not for every day of the year. Now, how many of you know that's not a coincidence? I mean, you would think one time would be good enough, right? Once would be good enough. One fear not. But God knows us, doesn't He? Because most of us would be like, hey, God, I used that fear not thing yesterday. What am I supposed to do about fear today? By the way, don't ever think you're the only one, that you're alone when you get overwhelmed with fear, because that's just simply not true. Everyone else is in the same boat with this one, at least from time to time. Some may be better at avoiding it than others, but all of us have fear that we have to fight from time to time. It's like someone said in our small group time on one Sunday morning recently. She said, when things are good in my life, I start thinking, okay, when is the other shoe going to drop? Can you identify with that kind of thinking? Boy, I sure can. But that's just how our enemy operates. Oh, so you're happy today? It can't last. It won't last. I'll see to it. That sort of thing runs through our minds. Or when we're going through a difficult and trying time, then the enemy comes to or attempts to sabotage our minds to think things will never get better. Have you ever experienced that kind of fear? What's the use? It's not going to get better. Things are never going to change. And of course we know that's not true, because Paul says in Romans 8, for instance, that God will take even the toughest of times and turn them around on the enemy by making them actually work for good to us. Have you found that to be true? Where you had something unfortunate happen in your life that really turned out to be a blessing in disguise? It happens. I read an old story about a shipwreck survivor, and he washed up on a deserted island. And each day as he cried out to God to be rescued, he would search the horizon for a ship, but no help arrived. Finally, he managed to collect some materials, and he built a hut to live in, and every day he prayed to God that God would send someone to rescue him. One afternoon, he returned from searching for food to find his worst nightmare had happened. His hut was in flames from a cook fire, and everything that he had burned to the ground. So he sat down on the ground as this hut finished burning, complaining to God the whole time. Why me, God? Why did you allow this to happen to me? Well, the next morning, when he awoke, he was surprised to see a sailing vessel anchored just off his island. And as he was rescued by those sailors, he asked them, how did you know I was here? And the captain replied, We saw your smoke signal yesterday afternoon and had to come. And that's it, isn't it? What he thought was the worst that could happen to him had turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to him. He had nothing to fear all along. So here's the question. Do you happen to remember the things that you feared, let's say 10 years ago? Think about it just for a second. Can you remember what you feared? And I'm sure there's a couple of major things that you'll never forget, but those day-to-day fears. Chances are you cannot. And the reason why, well, actually there's two reasons, basically. One is that fears are cyclical. In other words, they come and they go, and they come and they go. They ebb and they flow. Also, secondly, most of what we fear never comes to pass. In fact, I read that of our worries and of our fears, 40% of them will never happen. 30% are in the past. We can't do anything about them. They can't be helped. 12% of our fears and worry concern the affairs of other people and aren't really our business after all. But boy, don't we like to stick our nose in someone else's affairs. So, and then 10% of our worries and fears are about things we have no control over. 8%, only 8% of our fears and worries are valid. And guess what? With God, all things, even those 8%, are possible. Incidentally, if fear is your bane, I would encourage you to memorize like 1 Timothy 1:7 and just quote it often. 1 Timothy 1:7 says, God has not given you the spirit of fear. He gives you power, love, and soundness of mind. And how many of you know when you have power and you rest in the love of God and your mind is sound, fear won't have much of a chance of bombarding your life? All right, let me wrap this up with a thought, especially for those of you who struggle with fear and hopelessness or have trouble giving others hope because you have no hope to give. Because it's true, isn't it, that I cannot give something that I don't have myself. For instance, as much as I would like to give each of you watching today $1 million, and I would if I had it to give, but I can't because I don't have it. The same is true with the notion of hope. If I don't have any hope, I can't give any hope away, right? So think about this. Jesus spoke of the law of the harvest in Luke chapter 6. In verse 38, he says this, what you give away, you will always receive back. Your gift will return to you in full and overflowing measure, pressed down, shaken together, making room for more and running over. That sounds like a good deal, doesn't it? So here's the challenge for you. Ready? Why not ask God this week to lead you to one person who is feeling hopeless, battling fear? One person this week. And then you do or give whatever it takes to float hope their way. Just one person, and see what God does. And not only what He does for them, but what He in turn does back for you. Do you need some hope? Give some hope away. That's it for today. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you again, God willing, next week. I pray you be blessed with an absence of fear and a heart full of hope this week. See you soon. Bye-bye.